Okay, I'll try. Okay? As soon as you're born, they make you feel small by giving you no time instead of it all, till the pain is so big you feel nothing at all. A working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be.
In state of war, would it just be?
Well, the missing element was a reality, you know, the fact that I wasn't wanted and that my worst fears had come true.
When I was younger, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any way.
John Lennon, one of the most widely recognised faces in the world, from the most successful pop group of all time.
To me, John Lennon means imagine, freedom, and love.
Visionary, activist, pro-mankind.
Well, he was always the edgy one, gave a little bit of spice.
John is the one who started it all.
But how many people know the real John Lennon? The personality formed through his childhood experiences and the things that happened to him before he became famous.
Won't you please, please help me?
During the 1800s, Liverpool's importance as a seaport had already attracted large Welsh and Irish communities. But when Ireland's staple food crops were destroyed by potato blight in the 1840s, thousands of starving families fled to Liverpool. Among them was John's great-grandfather, James Lennon.
When James Lennon arrived in Liverpool in the 1840s, he turned up in a place which really was a city of plague, known as the Hospital and Cemetery of Ireland, as hundreds of thousands of people escaped the horrors of poverty and the potato famine. We refer to Liverpudlians as Scousers, and we know Scouse actually comes from lobscouse, a Scandinavian thing, but Scouse is clearly Irish stew by any other name. And that really is the key bit of the Liverpool melting pot. It's the Irish who give so much to making sure that Liverpool is sort of in the north of England, but not really of it. It's somewhere completely different. Well, I mean, for me, you know, Lennon is the classic sort of hyphenated identity that not many migrants within the United Kingdom get, but you do have this genuine Liverpool Irish thing. And I think that Liverpool Irish thing is at the heart of the fact that we're living in the People's Republic of Merseyside, and it's that sort of irreverence towards the establishment, which I think Lennon epitomises.
We were a port, the second biggest port in England, also between Manchester and Liverpool. That's where all the north was where the money was made in the 1800s, whenever it was. That was where all the brass and the heavy people were, and that's where the despised people were. We were the ones that were looked down upon by the southerners as animals, and also a great amount of Irish descent and blacks and Chinamen and all sorts of. It was a real. It's like San Francisco, you know. It was a very poor city and tough, but people had a sense of humour because they're in so much pain, you know. So they're always cracking a joke, and they're very witty, and it's Irish place, you know. It's where the Irish came when they ran out of potatoes, and it's where black people were left or worked as slaves or whatever, and creative communities. It's cosmopolitan, and it's where the sailors would come home with the blues records from America on the ships.
Liverpool's dominance as Britain's second city of empire created thousands of jobs in shipping and dockwork. It was in this busy world that John's parents, Alfred Lennon and Julia Stanley, met before marrying in 1938. The Stanleys were a close-knit family from Welsh and Irish backgrounds, with free-spirited Julia being one of 5 sisters.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
This country is at war with Germany.
The outbreak of World War II in 1939 turned Alf Lennon's life upside down. From his peacetime role as a ship's steward, Alf became one of 10,000 Liverpool seamen keeping Britain's supplies flowing across the Atlantic. Dangerous work indeed, but danger was coming closer to home. Hitler's Luftwaffe was planning to destroy the vital port at all costs.
Liverpool suffered tremendously in the Blitz. I think it was the second in terms of casualties after London. Nearly 4,000 people were killed. The actual damage to houses was extensive. Huge places were blown up. So there was a real fear of bombing.
Run, rabbit, run, 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 rabbit.
On October the 9th, 1940, Julia Lennon gave birth to her first child, John Winston Lennon.
The day that Lennon was born, we do have a record of the Luftwaffe bombings. There was no bombing raid over Liverpool that night. I would think at the end of the Battle of Britain, you could say that Churchill was at the height of his popularity at that point. So there are people who named their children after Winston Churchill. Not that many, it has to be said.
So run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run, run, run.
The early wartime years saw John and Julia living with her parents in a small house in Newcastle Road. But although John's father, Alf, paid the rent, he was rarely home. He was destined to be at sea for months at a time.
Here we have another kind of myth that John Lennon's father ran away to the Merchant Navy. But of course he was an indentured member of the Merchant Navy, and the Merchant Navy was a key part of the war effort. We needed to keep those merchant ships going, bringing those goods from America, bringing those armaments from America as well. So he didn't have a choice here. So really, he didn't run away from John Lennon. He just went back to doing what he'd always done, which was to be a member of the Merchant Navy.
During a voyage in 1943, Alf's luck ran out when he left his ship in New York, hoping to join another and improve his prospects. Without the right documents, he was left high and dry and held as an illegal alien on Ellis Island. His pay was stopped, and Julia feared the worst. Suddenly without money, Julia was forced to seek part-time work in 2 pubs, and it was here she began a casual affair with a soldier, Vernon Taffy Williams. Ever-changing domestic arrangements and different father figures during John's early years were to leave their lasting scars. His real father, Alf Lennon, came home to find Julia pregnant by another man. Then, amid the arguments, Julia surprised everyone by spurning both men. With his marriage over, Alf took John to stay with his brother Sidney before returning him to Julia's oldest sister, Mimi Smith, and her husband, George.
I think what's interesting about Lennon's wartime experience is that he's not evacuated. So he doesn't go to North Wales as many children from Liverpool went. I think if we look at Lennon's early life, we can see that it was an era of great austerity. Rationing, of course, had been brought in. The culture of Britain is completely different from the culture that comes in the 1950s. Mostly people listen to the radio. Joking is very important. A lot of the comedians that Lennon would have heard in his early life, Ted Ray, Arthur Askey and Tommy Handley, all come from Liverpool. The biggest musical stars, George Formby, the lad from Wigan. It would have been impossible to envisage a figure like Elvis Presley.
In June 1945, Julia Lennon gave birth to her illegitimate child, but following disapproval from her own father, the girl was given up for adoption. Despite Alf Lennon refusing to divorce Julia, she embarked on a new relationship with John Bobby Dykins. A sometimes salesman and waiter, he was just as unpopular as Alf in the Stanley family, and was often referred to as Spiv.
I just got word from a guy who heard from the guy next door to me.
Here we are on Newcastle Road, which is in the suburbs of Liverpool. We normally associate suburbs with respectability, but in this street there were many comings and goings which were less than respectable. The fact that Julia Lennon was living in sin but also an adulterous relationship is significant.
Julia and new partner Bobby Dykins took John Lennon to live in a small flat where their living arrangements soon fueled another crisis. News had reached Julia's father, Pop Stanley, that John was not only sharing a bed with Julia, but with Dykins too. Liverpool Child Welfare Service stepped in, and John was quickly sent to live with Mimi and her husband George in Woolton.
In 1933, protection of children legislation ensured that local authorities were able to step in. Priority was maintaining a child's relationship with his mother, but the mother may well be considered fit to rear the child. However, the environment the child is being reared in could be deemed unsuitable. John Lennon's effective sleeping arrangements with Bobby and his mother. What happened was that he was transferred from one Liverpool to another. In many ways, of course, Lennon was a migrant within Liverpool. His early years, even though he may not remember many of them, were probably very formative. And that old Liverpool, which he returned to through music, through gangs, through the youth culture of the time. It's almost as if John Lennon carried the old Liverpool with him in his DNA or in his early environmental experiences.
Mother, you had me, I never had you. I wanted you. You didn't want me.
With John now living at Mendip's, Aunt Mimi contacted Alf Lennon for financial assistance. Alf was happy to help, and even happier to take John on holiday to Blackpool. It seemed innocent enough, but Alf had bigger plans.
So I went to see all the mums and dads. I did Alf Lennon, you know, as well. I tracked him down, and he was working as a washer-up in a roadhouse in Chiswick. Alf had contact with Mimi. Mimi allowed him to come and see John, and they went off to Blackpool to stay with some friends. And it was in Blackpool that Alf got this idea that he would do a runner and go off with John, just the two of them, to New Zealand. And he told John this, and John obviously said, well, that'll be fun, going to New Zealand. He stays away longer than he should have done. We all get worried back in Liverpool, back in Woolton. And Julia tracks him down. Julia arrives at the door, and Alf said, no, he's coming with me to New Zealand. And Julia said, no, he's coming back. So there's a tug, this is Alf telling, there's a tug of war on the doorstep, and in the end, John chooses, and he chooses to go back with Julia, and then Alf disappears.
You left me, I never left you.
When I was doing the Beatles biography during those 2 years, and I was doing interviewing one-to-one, I would write everything down in a little red notebook. John, there we are, John 1, so that's the first John. And my dad, looking after me, took me to Blackpool, to his uncle's house. Mother going with another bloke. Which do you want to go to? Father and mother. And first of all, he decided his father, and then he decided to go with his mother. Then Mimi not allowed me with, oh yeah. So he chose to go with Julia, but Mimi wouldn't allow him to go with the Dykins. Ended up with Mimi, so that's it.
Once back in Liverpool with John, Julie was embroiled in another heated row with her sister Mimi. The scene took place in front of John and his cousin Layla.
Mimi said to her, and I was in the room, and Mimi will not deny it, you are not fit to have this child. She wanted to take John to live with Bobby there. And she said, no, you're not. And Mimi wanted him. He was a very sweet little boy, you know, very cute. And she wanted him. Mimi didn't have children. She said, you're not fit to have this boy.
Julia once again gave John over to Mimi and returned to live with Bobby Dykins.
No real impression that my mother actually wanted me because she wasn't there, or father. But still, one of the hardest things is to realise that actually they didn't want you. No, they didn't want me. That is a fact. I was not wanted. No wonder I feel shitty, because I couldn't explain it as a child. You just know that something's not right, something is not there. And that is the big trauma, to experience that.
After years of upheaval with different homes and different people, John finally had some stability in his life, and while he still occasionally saw his mother, his home appeared to be settled in leafy Woolton with Aunt Mimi and Uncle George in Mendips.
To Menlove Avenue back in the 50s, there would have been tram lines going down the middle, a little hedge either side of that. Obviously there'd be some traffic, but not as much as there is today.
It's really busy, isn't it? I mean, it's a kind of, well, it's a major thoroughfare in Liverpool, Menlove Avenue. Yeah.
This is Mendips. This is where John lived from the age of 5, mostly all the way through to 1963 when the Beatles went down to London. Most importantly for John was his bedroom. His bedroom is the small window above the front door. That's where he did his thinking, his writing, his drawing. So what sort of things do you think he would have been reading?
Well, I know you'd have definitely found some of Richard Compton's Just William books in there. I always find it's weird imagining him reading these kind of books. I've got a couple here, William the Rebel, maybe not so unusually, William the Outlaw. But in another way, it just reinforces an idea that we might have of Lennon as a kind of gang leader, because the one thing you know about the Just William books is he has his own little clique, a bunch of people he runs around with. And I think he had that when he lived here. And he ended up having it in the Beatles as well. You could argue, you know, the Beatles were a gang. So he read stuff like this, but also, I mean, I guess it's well known, he loved the Lewis Carroll books, Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. So I guess that's the kind of thing he'd be reading. Just thinking about him in that room up there, though, I love the idea of him listening to Radio Luxembourg. And the thing I love about Radio Luxembourg is it was a stronger signal at night. It's almost like this organic thing that's tuned into the planet, you know, so when it goes dark, the signal gets louder. So that little room is like a self-facilitating multimedia centre. He's plugged into the world, or to Europe at least, via Radio Luxembourg. He's reading books, he's got a typewriter, so he's kind of producing text as well. And also it's a room, you know, it's a kind of refuge, it's his childhood and adolescent space, I guess.
Well, this is Vale Road, of course. We're standing outside my house. Just further down the road on the left is where Ivan Vaughan lived, and he was the guy that introduced Paul McCartney to John Lennon. Further up the road on the left is Pete Shotton's house, and behind me at the back here, Menlove Avenue, is where John lived. It was very much like my own house, really. You weren't allowed to go in through the front door, you had to go round the back. Mimi was a sort of, she was a bit of a disciplinarian. She was, you know, very keen on John doing the right thing. Uncle George was a very affable chap, very pleasant, quiet, good old boy.
John's life at Mendips was made easier knowing he still had love and support from his extended family. His Aunt Meta, Uncle Robert and Cousin Stan lived in Scotland, where he visited regularly. While across the River Mersey lived Aunt Nanny, Uncle Sidney and cousin Michael. And Harry lived even closer with Uncle Norman and cousins Layla and David in Woolton. And of course, John still saw his mother and new half-sisters Julia and Jackie.
Oh, give me land, lots of land, under starry skies above. Don't fence me in.
The world that John grew up in and I grew up in, when the war finished, we were brought up in the way of our parents' lives, which were in the 20s and 30s. And it was a gentle, quiet, cosy way of life.
When the Second World War ended, everybody thought that rationing would end. But of course, because we hadn't rebuilt our trade, because we were still pretty impoverished, rationing actually went on. So really the austerity of the war kind of continued until the sort of early 1950s.
We had no television, of course. We did have a radio.
My big early memory is of children. The children coming out into the streets again after the war because they'd been locked away for safety reasons. And dozens of them, you know, in the streets playing.
We used to go up to the Saturday morning matinees, the cinema. That was really a riot.
We had freedom to run.
Well, there was four of us in the gang. It'd be Pete Shotton, Ivan Vaughan, John and myself. I always felt that John was the leader. Well, this is the Tip. It used to be called the Tip, and it was part of our playground. We used to play soccer on here and cricket, and it was also a shortcut to Menlop Avenue.
And this was the stretch of land that went between Menlop Avenue and Vale Road. So this is where John and his young friends would play. It was just like derelict waste ground. See on this photo here, John's on his bike, obviously having a lot of fun, and it is just open land, quite different obviously to what it's like now.
But this is part of the landscape of Lennon's childhood, just as much as Strawberry Fields was going to be later on.
Yeah.
This kind of, and I guess at the time, looking at this photograph as well, it would have been a very shabby, very post-war, very derelict sort of edgeland between the suburbs, you know, this kind of little green corridor. I mean, it's been really tidied up now. Yeah. It's a lot greener anyway. Yeah. But this would have been important to him.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the great things for John, in a way, was coming from Menlop Avenue. Then he'd walk across the Tip this way, because right over here is Pete Shotton's house. And that's close to Nigel Wally's house and Ivan Vaughan's house as well. And this is where, and John must have been 5, 6 years old, not long moved into the area. And he's almost integrating into this little gang. But Pete is obviously the leader, and John wanted to get that leadership from Pete. So they end up here, somewhere, having a little scrap. And at Sunday school, Pete Shotton had realised that John's middle name was Winston. And so Pete decides to start taunting John and calling him Winnie. And that used to drive him mad. So John ends up on top of Pete on the floor. But you know, it's not fists, not punching him or anything, but it's verbals. It's don't you ever call me that again. And I suppose in some ways, again, we're looking at the Outlaws, aren't we? With what? Just William?
Just William books, yeah. And that's where they would have reinforced the sense of their kind of outsiderness and their gang mentality in this space away from the adult world. Everything would have been reinforced in a place like this. I'm also interested that Winnie upset him so much. Words will names will never hurt me, but it had the same effect as sticks and stones for Lennon. Yeah. And it's interesting, he became such a gobby and in many ways kind of unpleasant guy because he could lacerate with his mouth. He could really do a lot of damage with it. That's my sense of the young John Lennon.
But being out here in Woolton, which is very English, it's very villagey feel. There wasn't a strong accent. John didn't have a strong Liverpool accent.
No, this is the thing. Mimi wouldn't have liked that. They called it talking broad, didn't they? But the accent, as so often happened in those days, was tidied up and removed from young kids a little bit, like the wildness has been knocked out of this space that we're in now.
When it used to be,
After 6 months at Mospitz Lane Primary School, Mimi's aspirations for John saw him enrolled in another school, Dovedale Primary School.
I was very lucky to go to Dovedale Road School, Dovedale Road County Primary as it was called then. It was probably one of the, if not the best school, one of the best schools in Liverpool, South Liverpool. When you were talking about John Lennon, although I was the year below and I didn't mix with him, I was aware of him. You knew who he was.
It didn't take too long to discover that he was different. Apart from anything else, he didn't live with a mother and father, and he lived with an auntie and uncle. That of itself is pretty strange.
I remember seeing a wee kiddie being stuck up against the wall for dinner tickets, you know. Now, John didn't do these things often himself. It was others. It was others that did these things for him. And he just had a charisma as well, you know, that not everybody, tons of people wouldn't like it, but there were lots of people that were drawn to it.
I mean, that's one class, 42, I think, boys in one class. Take quite a lot of handling. Mostly I remember John, not so much in the classroom in those days, but more in the playground. You know, John was tough, but mostly verbally, not physically. He only ever would get in a fight if he knew he could win. But he was very good. I mean, he had a choice of language. All my best swear words would have come from John.
And I lost my mum, 9½, 10. And my Aunt Mina in Pittsburgh, America, felt so sorry for me. She sent me a big package of candy, cowboy outfit. This business of cowboys was into our culture. We were all possessed with cowboys. And I'd got this wonderful, wonderful Colt 45 from my Aunt Mina in America that foolishly took it to Dovedale Road School. And I must have been galloping round, you know, dancing around the playground and firing this off, and he'd seen it, John, and he sent these two guys who I knew were part of his group, and they got hold of me, kicked me in the balls. I didn't take the gun off me. By God, I was ill. I was ill for days afterwards. I know it was Lennon because these two guys were part of his group.
Life is but a dream. It's what you make it. Always try to give. Don't ever take it.
This was a photo, the existence of which was unknown for about 50 years, and it suddenly appeared when the teacher who had taken the photograph, Fred Bolt, finally died. Fred used to lead the school camp from Dovedale Road to primary school every year to the Isle of Man. But I think for all of us, it was the first time we'd been away from home without our parents. And you can see John Lennon right at the front. Standing next to him is Jimmy Tarbuck. And the body language in the photograph is interesting. Just behind that's me, Michael Hill behind. And here is Ivan Vaughan, who was to play such a significant part in Beatles history by introducing John Lennon to Paul McCartney. John's very much pushing with his arms out. He's sort of, I'm the leader, you keep back. And I'm just happy here, with the biggest grin. And you could see me standing. I was the tallest boy in the school when we left about a year later.
Dovedale Road was quite a sporty school. I don't know how it came to me to be in this boxing match, and I don't know how John came to be in the same boxing match, but he and I were thrown together. And John and I donned our boxing gloves, and into the ring we went, intending to knock hell out of each other. John's eyesight wasn't particularly good, and somehow he managed a lucky punch on my nose. And the minute your nose gets punched, your eyes water. So there's John Lennon with not much sight, me couldn't see 2 feet in front of me, running around this rope ring. As you got near the ring, they would push you back into the centre. It was the longest 2 minutes of my life. That memory stays in my mind forever. It's never gone away all these years, and it still stands out. I was in the boxing ring with John Lennon.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields. Nothing is real, and nothing to get hung about.
So, I mean, we're right around the corner from Mendips, aren't we? How far away are we, what, 100, 200 yards?
Exactly, this is Vale Road. Vale Road goes and arches right behind Mendips where John lived. And he spent a lot of time here because this is where his outlaws, his friends, this is where they lived here, the Ivan Vaughan, Nigel Wally and Pete Shotton. They all lived here, and of course, this is where they would come to, because this was the rear boundary of Strawberry Fields, not the gates that we all think of. This is where John would come with his friends. Most importantly, was the mansion that used to stand in the grounds of Strawberry Field. Now, this was up on top of the hill, and John could actually see from the back of Mendips this house, and it looked like, you know, a castle. So you've got a vivid imagination, as we know John had. This was a fabulous place to come and to explore.
And he would have used the unofficial entrance. That's why there's a ladder here, have you noticed?
I hadn't even noticed that one.
They would have bunked over the wall, him and his mates.
Well, of course, because if you've got a group of teenage lads, a big wall, private property, you know, they're going to climb over, aren't they? Go and see what's there. And of course, out here, everything's real. Over there, nothing is real.
I'm thinking, you know, the 50s, the 60s and the 70s were a golden age of den building in this country after the war. When kids had to find that space away from the adult world, whether they were just children or adolescents, they liked to find a space that was outside of all the ordinary rules, you know, and I think this must have been that kind of space for them. If you think about the Just William books as well, it's all a gang, isn't it, and a gang mentality. And this is where he would have gone over the wall with his mates. You know what, though? I'm also thinking of one of his other favourite books, Alice in Wonderland. And if we look at the title page, it's possibly the most famous scene in the entire book, which is where Alice follows the white rabbit and finds herself going down the rabbit hole into a kind of very inverted world. And I guess that's the same kind of thing as what he's up to here, the young Lennon. He's finding another space where nothing is real. Can I just say as well, we're in the middle of Sandstoneopolis here. This part of South Liverpool, it might come as a surprise to people who think of Liverpool as a kind of, or thought of Liverpool and the Beatles when John was here as a kind of grimy, industrial port city. I mean, and it was that, but it's also got its sandstone suburbs, and I think of this part of Liverpool as a kind of giant walled garden. It reminds me of the Secret Garden, Francis Hodgson Burnett, the Victorian sense of this space out of the ordinary where the children go. Listen, I can't resist. I think I'm going to climb the ladder.
And can we see what John would have seen in Strawberry Field?
I'm afraid it's gone from nothing is real to real estate. It's all been built over.
So it's all gone. I wonder what John would have made of that.
I mean, it's lovely, but it's not otherworldly.
No.
Like every other child in primary school, John sat the all-important 11+ exam to determine which senior school he would go to.
There's an exam they have in England that they hang over your head. You know, there's a couple of them, but one of them is called 11+, and they hang it over you from age 5. You know, if you don't pass the 11+, which you take at 11, obviously, then you're finished in life. So that was the only exam that I ever passed because I was terrified.
John's success led to the next big step, a prize place at Quarry Bank, a boys-only grammar school close to Calderstones Park. He also took another big step by renewing his relationship with his mother.
Quarrymen old before our birth, straining each muscle and sinew, toiling together, Mother Earth conquered the rock that was in you.
Same in the quarrying, all is done. Readily we'll refute 'em. We are the quarriers, school our stone. Hoc ex metallo virtutem.
The Quarry Bank school motto is ex hoc metallo virtutem.
I recall it as out of this quarry comes manhood.
I mean, I look back on 5 years at a really good state grammar school at Quarry Bank, and like, you could go on to go to university and become a doctor, a dentist, or whatever.
Well, the school, I mean, in first arriving here, you were sort of in awe of it. Beautiful building. It was a school to aspire to get to.
I mean, when we went from Dovedale to Quarry Bank, John was respectable. I think he was quite angelic. This was his angelic period. But at Quarry Bank, he did quite well in his first year, even in the top half, and kind of did a progressive decline, almost accelerating decline. And by the end of 5 years, they were in the bottom form. Had there been a form below, they would have been in the bottom of that one.
They were sort of assessing whether you went into the A stream, the B stream, or the C stream. And both John and I and a few others went into the B stream and sort of held our own for a year or two. And then we went down to 4C. The rot was setting in then. We were having more fun than education.
John's mother Julia had always come to visit him at Mendips. But now John is older, he starts to go round by himself to her house. Their relationship becomes closer thanks to their shared love of music.
He talked about going to our house, wearing these funny clothes, putting knickers on her head and doing silly things. And he told me about, as he's told everybody since, about teaching him to play the guitar with banjo chords, which didn't really work, and the song she sang. So he thought she was a gas.
Everybody listened to the Goon Show. It was fabulous.
And the following morning, you could get the whole script regurgitated with all the funny voices. Do you remember the funny voices?
We all followed the Goons. He thrived on that sort of humour and probably took it a stage further.
The Daily Howl, written by John Lennon, was just his stories about life as it was happening all around. His home life, the life at school, his imagination running a bit wild.
If you look at his caricatures, they were absolutely brilliant at age 14, 15, 16. And he could have made it, you know, he would have been another Gerald Scarfe.
I think the one that particularly recognised his talent with words and pen and his cartoons was Burnett, a sort of relatively new teacher who came to the school, possibly when we were in the third year or something like that. Yeah. He sort of encouraged John to write more of his humorous stuff and draw his cartoons, but, you know, not in the school time, John, not in the middle of the lesson.
There's always one teacher in each school that would usually be an art teacher or an English language or literature kind of thing. If there's anything to do with writing or art, I was okay at it. Anything to do with science or maths, I just couldn't get it in, you know. Yeah. So, but most subjects were science and maths because supposedly they don't want artists, you know. Even at art school, they tried to turn me into a teacher. They tried to discourage you from painting and, you know, why not be a teacher? Because then you can paint on Sunday.
Idling his way through adolescence, and tragedy struck John once again. Uncle George, the man he'd grown to love as his father, died suddenly in 1955.
Well, I think with John, because there was an underlying anger at the world, which became more evident as he went through grammar school. I think particularly it came to a head when his uncle died at quite a young age. John was about 14, and that really tipped him over the edge. He just lost all interest. Yeah, he just was doing his own thing, and I think there was part of the anger was turned against the school system.
You never make it. That's what they told me.
If you didn't finish school?
One maths master wrote, "You're on the road to failure if he carries on this way."
The real problem with John was that he had a dislike of authority. If he was told he had to do something, then he automatically went into smart reverse. In our house, he was known as that Lennon, as in keep away from that Lennon. Yeah. If anybody was going to take anything too far, it was John. So he was an interesting guy to be around from that point of view.
Sure.
Behaviour, I think that he was considered to be, you know, working against serious study.
Very bad behaviour. I mean, goodness knows what on earth that was. Chewing in class, that wouldn't be just one occasion at all, no. Misbehaviour again, yes. Talking in class. Yes, he always was talking in class.
But he was actually getting detentions while he was on detention for mucking about.
Yeah, he would.
Some of these teachers, do you remember Fred Yule?
Yeah.
He was a...
big fat fella with one leg.
That's right. He'd been a navigator in Wellington bombers.
Was he?
Well, he was telling us about this, you know, how he got shot up and lost his leg. I think they were doing a bombing run over Algiers or something like that.
Right.
So he wasn't going to stand any
No,
messing
no,
about with John Lennon.
No.
And at one time he picked John up by the lapels and held him up there because he was a hugely strong bloke.
Yeah.
Because all the strength from his tin leg went into the rest of him.
Yeah.
And he just picked John up and any more of that Lennon.
Once again, he's put on his writer's hat to follow up the success of his first book in his own right with another epic of inconsequence, A Spaniard in the Works, a little work full of pieces of political wisdom such as you've just heard, and moving poems like The Wumber Log or The Magic Dog.
Whilst all the tower was sleepy, crept a little boy from bed, to feign the wondrous people what lived when they were dead. He packed a little voucher for his dinner neath a tree. Perhumps a tiny dwarf or two would share a bite with me. Perchamp I'll see the Wumberlog, the highly feathered crow, the laughing, leaping Harris Tweed, and good old Uncle Joe. He packed the very trunk case, clean sockers for a week, his book and Denzil for his notes, then out the windy creep. He met him friendly Magic Dog, all black and curlew too, what flew him fast in second class to do what he must do.
And what did people think of him? I mean, a lot of the other pupils wouldn't like him because he never owned up to doing anything, so that it would be the whole class that would be given a detention or held back. So not everybody was a fan of John Lennon's.
Do you ever see your old schoolmates?
No, I've seen a few old school friends, not teachers. No.
Yeah.
Most of them dislike me, except for one or two. You know. So I am always glad to remind them.
Was there ever a teacher
their
that
incredible awareness they had?
I'm a rolling stone, all alone and alone, for a life of sin I have paid the cost.
And we were not supposed to leave the school premises at lunchtime, but we got in the habit of leaving and going down to my house, which was about a 10-minute bike ride away, down in Dovedale Road, just along the road from the primary school. John's best friend and my best friend, so that was John and Pete Shotton. But so with my best friend Don Beattie, the four of us were the regular routine was that they'd go and buy the fish and chips. I'd peel off and go home, and I was very domesticated. I'd warm the plates up and make some bread and butter. My mother was at work, that's how I could do that. It was innocent enough. I mean, the most we'd do is smoke one cigarette. We'd eat some fish and chips. We might have a few hands of shoot pontoon, but we'd listen to records. And from 14, I did a paper round. And John never had any money. He never did any work to get any, but he was always short of money. But I was the one who was buying records. And initially jazz, following my brother's interest. And then through things like Hank Williams. And John got really hooked on Hank Williams.
And now I'm lost, too late to pray. Lord, I paid the cost on the lost highway.
This was Easter 1956. We had the opportunity to go on a school exchange program to Amsterdam. And of the four friends, as we were then pretty close at Quarry Bank, only three of us went to Amsterdam. Now, John Lennon didn't go, and I wish I could tell you why he didn't go. I discovered this record, which had only just been released, and I discovered later it was been released about 2 days before. This record wasn't released in the UK for about another 6 or 9 months. And it was Long Tall Sally, Little Richard, just amazing. And the young guy in the shop told us about the record, we played it, and I said, wow. And I remember thinking, wait till John Lennon hears this record. I put this on, I told John, I said, I've got a record here, but that immediately got John's attention. So they're all quiet, put the record on. And this was on a good radiogram with a very good bass, and it was thumping out. Nobody at home, so I had it on loud.
Gonna tell Aunt Mary about a claim he has a misery, but he having a lot of fun, oh baby. Yes, baby. Ooh, baby. Having me some fun tonight.
You know, when it stopped, the silence was deafening. So we all look at John, waiting for him to say something, really keen to have his reaction. No reaction, just absolutely stunned. He didn't know what to say. And it was only a matter of weeks after that that he went out and bought a guitar.
I don't know what the date was, but it must have been early in 1956. John Lennon, Pete Shotton and myself had a little meeting outside the woodwork room with the idea of forming this skiffle group. John Lennon had the guitar that he didn't know much about playing. Pete Shotton had nothing, so he said, okay, well, the washboard will do you. I said, I'll supply the bass, because I'd been to the jazz clubs in town and knew all about Lonnie Donegan and the skiffle group, using a tea chest for a bass. I said, right, I will get the bass, because there was plenty in the school. What are we going to call it? I said, the Quarrymen, because we're at here, Quarry Bank High School. John Lennon said, no, he didn't like the idea. Pete Shotton said, you know, John, sounds okay. So he said, all right. So that was a Quarrymen. So later that afternoon, when it was all quiet, I zipped into the woodwork room, looked around, nobody here, grabbed the tea chest, and away down this little back lane. John Lennon, Pete Shotton, Eric Griffiths, and myself, Bill Smith. And that was the original four Quarrymen.
Now tell you where I'm going, boy. Down the Rock Island Line, she's a mighty good road. The Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yes, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you own the ride, you got to ride it like you find to get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line.
I was sitting back of my dad's car outside St Helens Market. There was a record shop there, and the door was open. And this fantastic sound came out of this record shop, and that was Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line. And it changed my life, as it did thousands of other people's lives. I came into school on the Monday morning and said to Eric Griffiths, I bought a banjo yesterday, Eric. Oh yes, he said, do you want to be in a group? He knew I couldn't play it because I'd only bought it the day before. Eric showed me the chords. We only played 3 chords, so it wasn't exactly rocket science. Our teacher's bass player, Bill Smith, for some reason never turned up to rehearsals, so we needed another bass player, so they asked Len, who was one of John's mates, to take over, and about the same time, Eric Griffiths was coming to work on school on the same bus as Colin was going to work, and found Colin had a set of drums, so very quickly we acquired a drummer and another bass player.
Anyone who had an instrument could join the band.
John and Eric then went to some guitar lessons, and after lesson 2, they realised they were getting nowhere because all they wanted was a few chords. So they went and complained to John's mother, Julia, who could play the banjo. And she said, well, if you tune the top 4 strings of the guitar like a banjo, the banjo chords I will show you will work, and that's what we did. And until Paul McCartney came along, John and Eric played banjo chords all the time.
Once we had 2 or 3 numbers under our belt, or maybe a couple more, I mean, where are we going to play?
This is Quarry Bank School Hall, and I used to come in here every morning. The school dances were started around 56. There was certainly a school dance in November 56. What we used to do was play the interval spot, because you used to have a dance band for waltzes, quick steps, etc. And then in the interval, then you'd have a skiffle group in the interval who'd play for about half an hour, and that was what we did.
I remember rehearsing in Rod's house, and then Mostly, I think it was Eric's house. Did a bit in Julie's house. I've rode Mum's house, yeah.
Yeah, when we were at Julia's house, she used to let us stand in the bathroom to practice because it was all tiles and you get a fantastic reverb sound, you know.
Well, John was the singer, so if he didn't know a song, he wasn't going to sing it. So there was no point suggesting something to him that he didn't know.
Or didn't like.
So, well, didn't like, yeah. So, I mean, he didn't sort of, you know, say, I'm the boss or anything like that. But I think we just accepted
he was the singer.
Well, he's the singer.
He was only just part of the group. He wasn't called a leader of the group. Yeah. He had his role to play, and we all had our role to play.
Yeah, it was all very casual.
Well, it's one for the money, two for the show, three to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoe.
But then, of course, Elvis came along. John wanted to be Elvis, didn't he?
As a role model, he outshone Lonnie Donegan by a million miles, Elvis. Rock and roll was a lot sexier than skiffle. So when rock and roll came along, people realised that the same 3 chords they'd learned to play skiffle worked for rock and roll.
In 1957, Liverpool held street parties to celebrate the anniversary of the granting of the city's charter by King John in 1207. In Rosebery Street, Toxteth, the Quarrymen were booked to play.
Well, Toxteth was different in those days because of the multicultural aspect. Lots of black, lots of white people, you had Chinese. The party was to celebrate the granting of the charter by King John. You know, we decorated the street and all the kids were all excited. The parents were excited, and especially when they knew there was a band coming, the likes of the Quarrymen.
Charlie Roberts, who asked me to do it, you know, because his mum was one of the organisers. I'd known Charlie for some time, and he was a drinking buddy, so... I remember we all met up in the village and jumped on a bus down here and arrived about midday, didn't we? I think we set up in your house, and then I was right out the door, around the corner to the nearest pub. Back from the pub, and then I think it's time to get back on the back of the wagon, wasn't it?
It was a nice day like today as well, sun shining.
Oh, Maggie, Maggie May, they have taken her away, and she never walked down Lime Street anymore. Well, that judge really found her, the Robin the homeward bounder, you tell your Robin no good, Maggie May.
It was all acoustic. That's why I'm on the back of the wagon, sort of quite a distance away from the rest of the lads. Lennon's voice was amplified through a small amplifier, which I think was hanging out the bedroom window, from what I can remember. John never wore glasses, and he was extremely short-sighted, and so there was probably a certain amount of squinting going on. But it wasn't necessarily that John was looking at the girls. I think the girls would tend to sort of look at John, and either way, it made them, you know, the boyfriends jealous. So, and then I saw a lot of heads going together, and a lot of mumbling. I leaned down and said to one of the guys, "What's going on?" And he said, "They're going to get Lennon." John wasn't hanging around to get got. So we just all abandoned the wagon, and the nearest safe haven was Charlie's house. So we all piled into Charlie's house.
It took quite a while for it to quieten down. Eventually, Bobby came, a policeman, put them on the bus home. Somebody gave me a camera. At the time, they were just snaps. And as you say, the very first photos of John playing live. So I'm always happy to show them to people. Technically, they're not good photographs, maybe, but they're a piece of history just the same.
The end of John's long school years came in June 1957, with a lengthy summer break in the tree-lined suburbs of South Liverpool, and the chance for the Quarrymen to perform once more, this time at a fete at St. Peter's Church in Woolton Village.
If anybody invited us to get up and play, that was fairly exciting, but you know, this was really a big day in Woolton.
St. Peter's Rose Queen was... Apart from, there were 2 things, Bonfire Night and the Rose Queen. It was like Carnival in Rio for us.
The fact that the church took a chance on that, really, I mean, we were doing like devil's music, weren't we? A skiffle and a bit of rock and roll. So the fact that they had us on the fete in the first place, I think was a huge leap of faith.
So Ivan Vaughan was 1 year behind. He also took the 11 plus and passed, and he wanted to join up with the rest of his friends, so they're all at Quarry Bank. His parents vetoed this because they didn't want him to be in the same school as John Lennon. So he was put down to the Liverpool Institute. He became friends with another boy who was 1 year younger than us, who none of us knew, and this was Paul McCartney. That it was Ivan Vaughan who, on that fateful day at Woolton, fate brought his friend, his school friend, Paul McCartney, to St. Peter's Church in Woolton and introduced him to his other best friend, who was John Lennon.
This is where John Lennon met Paul McCartney for the first time, 6th of July 1957, and it was a garden fete. Now, what to you is a garden fete?
I'm thinking crowning of the May Queen, coconut shies, flower displays maybe, that kind of thing. Very English.
Yeah, an English garden party. The quarrymen themselves were actually on a float.
I love this photograph. It's so unadorned, so basic, so Spartan. It's the plainest float I think I've ever seen. I love the details. Chadwick, a haulier based in Hale Wood. Yeah. And then you've got this kind of tiny little attempt at adornments, which is just a couple of strings of bunting coming down the back. It's fantastic.
And of course, they were at the back of the parade. At the front, you've got a marching band, you've got the Scouts and the Brownies and the Youth Club. And there you've got the poor quarryman sat there. You can actually see from John, he's actually singing.
It is so English, though, and so kind of nostalgic as well. I mean, even these chairs, these kind of cloth-backed chairs, I remember from school assemblies in rooms, not unlike this one, actually. Yeah. The other weird thing about this, it's almost like they're sneaking something into something very English. You know, this is rock and roll, this is at the cutting edge of pop culture for the time. It's not just Americana, it's edgy, it's unstable. People haven't quite figured out what rock and roll is yet, you know.
Absolutely.
And they're bringing it on the back of a lorry, a flatbed truck, to a village fete in Woolton. It's an incredible kind of clash, don't you think?
Yeah, and the fact that they're bringing it to a church event. So a church event in 1957.
Let's get the chronology right, because it always kind of defeats me what the order in which things happened. The quarrymen play just over the way in a field. Yeah. That's their first gig, but they're doing 2 gigs that day, and in the break in between the 2, they come over here for a sound check, I suppose. Yeah. And they meet, Paul McCartney meets John Lennon, and he's introduced by a mutual friend. Is that the order of events?
That's basically it, yeah. And this was the famous photo that was taken on the day. All acoustic, apart from the microphone. So John's at the front, he's singing and staring right at the camera. He knows his picture's being taken. So then before the evening performance, they come into this hall, and you can see around there, that's where the stage used to be. And in that corner, there were the steps going up to the stage, just by that radiator. And then Ivan brings Paul, and John and the quarrymen are all standing, all sat, all around here, and they're tuning up. Ivan brings Paul over, and there you've got this great meeting of teenage lads. Ivan, again, is probably the one who says, well, go on, John, let Paul show you what he can do. So Paul gets John's guitar. So the first thing he does is he tunes all 6 strings. Now, that's more than anybody in the quarrymen can do. So already he's a superior musician. But the most impressive thing that Paul could do was that he'd learned to play a right-handed guitar upside down. So he flips the guitar upside down and starts playing and singing 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. And in a way, you know, when we go back to looking at this group of friends, and that's all they were, a group of friends having a bit of a laugh, suddenly from this point, from this meeting, the group becomes more serious. And within 5 months of this, most of the members of the Quarrymen are gone, and George Harrison's in the group. So by the end of 1957, you've got John, Paul and George together in a group, and that is your genesis of the Beatles.
Well, good word. Creation. I was thinking of a kind of creation myth, because we've got to recognise this is a site of pop cultural pilgrimage. People beat a path to this church hall door, and you would definitely subscribe to this kind of idea of the Beatles beginning here. I mean, there's something wonderfully neat about, well, there often is with the Beatles, but there's something wonderfully neat about an audition here being the genesis of the Beatles, and then an audition which Lennon hoped they'd passed on the rooftop of Apple headquarters at the end of the 60s, and that kind of bookends their career. That's the beginning and the end. And you think that's why people come here, because they want to be where the two met and where the group began.
This is where the Beatles started.
And we're standing right on ground zero of
That's it.
Beatles.
On the 12th, I'm ready to drag. Well, the 15th floor, I'm starting to sag. Get to the top, I'm too tired to rock.
With more than a little assistance from Mimi, John was enrolled at Liverpool College of Art in September 1957. Situated in Hope Street next to the Liverpool Institute, the college opened up a rich source of new friends and experiences.
Yes, there are lots of poets, artists. This was, I suppose, as far as Liverpool is concerned, a sort of bohemian area.
I loved the place. The building was so beautiful, this lovely classical old sandstone building. Fabulous high-ceilinged rooms to work in. It was just fabulous. I loved everything about it.
It was full of students virtually every day doing something, whether they were doing dress design or lithography or pottery.
Oh, this is June. She was the resident model at the art school, but she's worked for donkey's years. She was first at the Slade in London, and then she came up to Liverpool in the 50s.
I spent 50 years here, 9:30 in the morning till 9 at night. Oh, yeah, these were the academic days when you had to draw. That was the end of the 50s, and when John Lennon arrived, I was sitting there, and he looked at me, and then he went out. Okay, I put a coat on, he came back and introduced himself, said he was John Lennon, and he enrolled to do an art course, and he'd be drawing me, and would that be all right?
It was the first day in college, and he came over to me and said, "Are you the one that painted Lonnie Donegan?" and I said, "Yeah." And so we were friends evermore after that. That was the stamp of our friendship. These are two sketches that I did of John, 1958-ish. Bit scruffy. I think he was wearing check shirts in those days, tight trousers, pulled in, either old cords or something. Tony Curtis in the front, DA at the back. Buddy Holly glasses. He was very spotty at the time. He certainly wasn't a Scouser. No, he wasn't. And obviously he'd had, quite an informed home education from Mimi, because he was quite eloquent in his language, and he was bright, but he was lazy.
He was never quiet when he came in. He'd come into the room and start. He'd say anything that came into his head, and he'd tell you everything what happened the night before. Or he never came in, as I know him, and sat down quietly with his easel and his drawing and got on with things, you see. If the teacher was there, he was told to leave or get on with his drawing, you see.
Yes, well, okay, life class was always starting off quite seriously, and the master would be in the corner smoking his pipe, and we just got on with drawing June or painting June, whichever it was. And when it got really silent, all of a sudden John's head would pop up behind his easel. The nostrils would start flaring, and I knew, you just knew something was going to happen then. So he'd sort of start laughing like a hyena or leaping about, and then we were just in total hysteria. And it was like this every single time, one way or another. And the teachers, profs got a bit fed up with him, and they just ignored him, really. Most of them ignored him, but he did disrupt the class quite a bit. Well, these drawings came into my hands, and he gave me this book of drawings and a few loose sheets as well. And I couldn't believe it, but I've treasured them ever since, until I sort of had to sell them to somebody in the end. These are just prints, so I could remember them for myself. So it was an exercise book when he was still at Quarry Bank, and these were characters, were either tutors at the school or they were friends. And this was the Latin teacher in the school. I think his name was Mr. Colvin, something like that. Nicotine, the Irish madman. They're so funny, they're so humorous.
Well, John Lennon never did much art here. He was always interested in the theatre. He was always interested in going to these places like the Pavilion and the Empire Theatre and all that. And then the next day, I was very funny. He'd come in and do these impersonations of these stars he liked.
The drawings, I mean, there were miles and miles of them all over the place. He never stopped drawing. He'd make up a song as well about any subject. People walking past, he'd make a song up about them if there's something wrong with them. Well, especially when Paul and George came in for lunch, we'd creep up to Arthur Ballard's painting room and they would play all sorts of, you know, ongoing music, Buddy Holly stuff and Chuck Berry and all these things, and singing American stuff, really. And then they'd play some of their own little songs and funny songs. Oh, yes, he used to sing George Formby a lot. Believe it or not. That was always the finale. I'm leaning on a lamppost. And we'd just sit there doing our work preparation, whatever we do. We never just sat there and gawped, but we just listened to them. And they'd sing. It was just wonderful.
Well, he was loud, he was noisy. And if he liked, he'd decide who he liked, who he wanted to talk to, and who he would leave strictly alone, which is really a Liverpudlian characteristic.
People loved him or they hated him. And the ones that liked him, loved him, yeah.
I'm sure that his bombastic attitude a lot of the time was to cover up something vulnerable in himself. Because, he played the hard man.
Half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia.
John's carefree time as an art student was cut short when fate knocked on the door once again, with news that his mother Julia had been knocked down, killed by an off-duty policeman near John's home on Menlove Avenue. It was a shattering blow.
John's mother, Julia, was a very happy person, always laughing, joking. She was really a terrific person. I was going round to John's house, this was in the summertime, like we often did, on a daily basis. And when I reached the gate, Aunt Mimi was at the gate with Julia this side. And Julia said, oh, John's not here. He said, but you can have the pleasure of walking me down to the bus stop. I said, yep, that'd be great. Well, we got to the end of Menlove Avenue and we said our goodbyes and I peeled off to the right. She crossed over the first half, and at that point I heard a thump and I just saw Julia flying through the air. And I thought, Jesus Christ. I rushed over and she was laying there. I mean, it was obvious she was dead, I could see her hair fluttering over her face in the breeze. And I was just devastated.
Somebody rushed over to us and said, John's mum's died. And he was very, very silent. He never spoke to me. And he never mentioned his mother. And I think he bottled everything inside. It was very sad. We were all very sorry for him when we heard the circumstances of it.
And he was going along all these corridors saying his mother had been killed, and he was in a terrible state, terribly upset. Nobody could calm him down, and I remember him standing looking down that lift shaft. I came out and I was looking down that lift shaft. I thought, what the hell's he going to do?
And I always said to myself afterwards, well, if I'd have stayed with him 50 seconds more, it would never have happened. And John was upset about it. He was never the same with me for quite some time afterwards. He went into a shell. It really hit him hard.
I didn't notice any change in him at all. He either hid it very well, or I just didn't see.
But I can't remember him going into a mourning sort of mode. Just quiet, being rather quiet for a few weeks, that's all. I mean, he was still pranking and jumping about and making everybody laugh. Never stopped. Cynthia was a very, very serious worker. She was very talented, and she would have made also a great graphic artist. And then one day she said to me, "Do you know who I'm going out with? But don't tell anybody." I said, "Who?" She said, "John Lennon." I said, "Sin, what do you see in him?" She said, "Oh, I see a lot in him." And that was it. And I said, "Well, I think he's fabulous, but I wouldn't have thought he was your type."
It's his vulnerability, it's his cheek, it's the fact that he bared his soul. Foolishly, stupidly, but he bared his soul for everybody else to see.
Cynthia Powell later became John's first wife, but they had a troubled relationship.
John was controlling. He was a controlling person if he got half the chance, and was a bully if he got half the chance. And, you know, he beat up Cynthia, and there's other girls he was physically cruel to. So John, in their marriage, was doing that and was not very kind or nice to Cynthia. It's in his songs. What's that one about I was cruel to my woman? John wrote those lines in about I'm cruel to my woman, and he's cruel to lots of women.
Later, in the Beatles' years, John's attitude toward women would surface again at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party.
This house belongs to Paul's auntie, just over the way from me. It's Billy J. Kramer and this girl called Rose. So Lennon walks down and he sees her, and he's shouting at her, and she goes blah blah, and he goes like now, straight on the girl's bosoms, if you like. So she just gives him a back. I saw it, backhander. She every right to, you know, smack, get off me, you know. And he goes like that, and he gives it a full right hand, bang. And then she fell on the floor. People had let him off.
As well as Cynthia Powell, another art student became a significant figure in John Lennon's life, Stuart Sutcliffe.
Well, Stuart wasn't in my group. He was a year above with Rod Murray. And he was always in the painting department because he was a very good painter. And he was a very quiet fellow, a lovely person, very, very good painter, and took his work very seriously. And all the masters thought he was going to be great. I think some of them were a bit upset when he became a musician.
Stuart and John got on very well, largely because of not just their interest in fine art, but in music. They had the same sort of taste in music.
Yeah, I think John admired the talent of Stuart. He liked people that had a calming influence over him, I think, at times. Like Cynthia and Stuart, maybe, and various other friends.
I mean, John Lennon was told to leave here because he didn't do the art history.
I mean, usually people that weren't that interested left or were told to move on after the first year and a half or so. And I think John was told to move on because he just didn't do anything, you know.
At college, it was fast becoming clear that John's real passion was for music. While John still had no clear vision of how to make music pay, he was desperate enough to do labouring work to buy his first electric guitar. Clubs like the Casbah Coffee Club in West Derby were opening all over the city.
I was here on the night it opened. As we came in, the band that were playing were called the Quarrymen. They'd moved on from the skiffle music. These guys were playing electric guitars. Of the original members of the Quarrymen, there was only John Lennon who was here. Paul McCartney had joined, Paul had brought in George. I mean, George could play both of them off the stage. He was tolerated as a youngster simply because he was so good.
Let her go, boy. Go, go.
The move to Gambia Terrace here, the flat was really too big just for Stuart and myself. And Stuart said to John, would he like to share the back room? In the kitchen we had a shelf each for our food, including John. There was hardly anything else ever on John's shelf, but things used to disappear from our shelves, like your tin of beans was missing. But it would turn up again a couple of days later when he'd done a bit of shoplifting. I can't remember then whether they were called the Silver Beatles, the Beatles or something else. They were going through a flux of names and they practiced in the back room.
All my friends are popping the blues, it must be going round. All my friends are popping the blues, it must be going round.
They were bums. That's all they were, bums. You know, we all were.
But the Beatles, they weren't like ordinary rock bands. They were sort of a bit more arty, like studenty types, bohemian, you know.
John and Stuart got closer and closer. John insisted on Stuart being bass guitarist.
They didn't have a drummer, and they offered Johnny the job, he turned them down. Well, the big three were better then, weren't they? They weren't a band until Pete Best joined them.
And then they were offered this job in Hamburg on condition that they had a permanent drummer. Peter got the job, and a few days later he was on the boat.
In August 1960, John and his fellow Beatles squeezed into a van alongside their manager Alan Williams and his business partner Lord Woodbine for a date with destiny in Hamburg.
Well, I'm just out of school, like I'm real cool. Gotta dance like a fool, got the message that I gotta be a wild, I'm a wild one. Oh yeah, I'm a wild one. Gonna break loose, gonna keep her moving wild, gonna keep her swinging, baby, I'm a real wild child.
Pitching up 3 days later at a seedy club in Hamburg's notorious red light area, the five Beatles hit the ground running with a unique sound that soon pulled in the punters, including a group of German art students.
So when I came in there, in that place, I walked down the stairs, it was full of those leather jacketed, clad rockers with those Elvis, and then those rock and roll music. The Beatles on stage are the first guy I noticed who was really the quintessential rocker at the time, because they've also played at the seat there in their black leather jackets. The Beatles looked exactly like the audience, you know, with that Elvis do and all that. And it was John Lennon. I mean, really like, Jesus, he looked like Marlon Brando in the white one at the time.
Well, I'm a real wild one, and I like wild fun. In a world gone crazy, everything seems lazy. I'm a wild one.
We went then every day, every evening, because everything else was boring then in Hamburg. I never went to a jazz concert again. I only went to this rock and roll club, and right away, the very first night, we met the Beatles because we looked so different. I know that Stuart was the first who came to our table, and later John and Paul came. Now, Paul was always very nice and kind. I wasn't at all uncomfortable in Paul's presence because he was a charmer, and he was, all the time I knew him, and he was like that. But of John, I felt very uncomfortable because he made sarcastic remarks. No, first he said something about my clothes. Where do you get your clothes? He had never seen the green jacket or whatever, those sweaters I had. And I said, well, I bought everything I wear, you know, in Paris, you know. And then I said to soften it up, I said, on the flea market. And I remember then he made immediately fun, as if he put a flea from my jacket to Paul, and Paul made this. And they have this kind of reaction. I didn't know the Marx Brothers at the time. I had never seen the Marx Brothers then. They had this kind of made fun of everything, you know.
I've been on pills since I was 17, since I became a musician. the only way to survive in Hamburg, to play 8 hours a night, was to take pills. Like the waiters gave you the pills and drink. I was fucking dropped down drunk in art school. I was a pill addict until help, just before help, where we turned onto pot and we dropped drink. Simple as that. I've always needed a drug to survive.
When he got stoned, you know, he used to foam at the mouth, and he was sitting on stage and he'd sit on his amp, you know, and he'd just have a full blast on, going doing, doing, bang, hitting the strings, you know. And Horst Fascher, he was a hard lad, you know, in Germany. He come to me and said, "Hey John, do me a favour, can you turn that up?" And John go, he said, "You touch that again." He said, "No, I'll cut you and bleed and see you bastard," you know. He said, "Get off the stage," you know.
And I remember the day there was John, Paul and George and I, we four were sitting there. And he was specifically talking about my haircut. But then he did it like this, or like this, in front of Paul's hair. And then he had a comb and put it like that in front of Paul. And Paul immediately played the act, looked Marx Brothers, and did that Nazi salute, you know, immediately like Hitler, you know. And so that was typically John, you know.
They were actually a very poor band compared to the rest of them. But when they went to Hamburg, 6 hours a night, 6 days a week, they honed their act together and they came back.
That's what made us all, you know.
Oh, absolutely fantastic.
As you can already see, most of my photos are showing John. And that means that I was most fascinated by him as a photographer. As, you know, you see how he looks really like the cool rocker, you know, quintessential.
When he held his guitar up here, almost like a Ted, he was like a teddy boy on the stage. And he always fancied himself, and he couldn't knock a hole in a wet echo.
Say that again.
But he also fancied himself as a bit of a hard case, you know.
But John Lennon was more aggressive than any of the other Beatles in any way, without being in your face or threatening in any way. It was just the way that he dealt with and his authority.
Like sometimes you could not avoid the fact that he was there. And then other times, well, he'd go into his quiet moods.
They had decided when they were 16, 17, 18, I think, that they were going to be professional musicians. And when they came back from Germany, I think they were further along that road. They'd experienced a lot of success in Germany. They'd come together both musically, I would think, as a group of people. They were tighter together as well.
Now within touching distance of fame and fortune, the Beatles and their new manager Brian Epstein met up at Hamburg airport. But something was terribly wrong. Stuart Sutcliffe was missing. Astrid broke the news. Stuart, barely 21 years old, had died from a brain hemorrhage. The spectre of death had returned to haunt John once again.
John just freaked out. He completely freaked out. He freaked out as far as just laughing until tears came.
It affected all of us. I like Stuart as well. It was horrible. It was really bad, you know. He was the James Dean of the band. And if you talk about looks, he was the best looking of the band when he was with them. He wasn't with them long, but what he did do was important.
With Brian Epstein came another rapid change. Out went Pete Best and the Beatles' wild, leather-clad image, and in came Ringo and clean-cut boys in suits. Lennon's days as a rock and roll punk were over.
You know, I moved to Paris in September '61. John and Paul came to visit me just after I had been there 1 month. Among other things, they wanted to have the same kind of clothes. Take me to your flea market. It was one of their biggest desires. They asked me to cut their hair like I had mine. So the Beatles typically what was then known as a mop top, you know.
Personally speaking, the leather jacket era, '61, that was when Liverpool and the fans saw the Beatles as nobody else in the world ever saw them. They were pure rock and roll, and the leather jackets made them look even better. And it was when Epstein changed them and he groomed it out of them, I just think they lost a bit of earthiness, a little bit of the rock and roll stuff. I've always felt that. But the point is, you can't argue with the fact it worked.
We were four guys that I met Paul and said, do you want to join my band, you know? And then George joined, and then Ringo joined. We were just a band who made it very, very big, that's all. Our best work was never recorded, you know, in Liverpool, Hamburg, and around the dance halls, you know, and what we generated was fantastic. Well, we played straight rock, and there was nobody to touch us in Britain, you know. But as soon as we made it, we made it. The edges were knocked off. You know, Brian put us in suits and all that, and we made it very, very big, but we sold out, you know. And the music was dead before we even went on the theatre tour of Britain. We were feeling shit already.
The Beatles made it as Lennon promised they would. Their music changed the world, changed our society, and entertained millions. But even at the height of their fame, John's troubled childhood was never far behind. He became a father in 1963 when his first wife, Cynthia, gave birth to his son, Julian. But in a repeat of his own upbringing, John was an absent father. He also struggled with the pressures of being a Beatle, and what became one of his most famous songs was originally written as a ballad, a cry from the heart.
When I was young, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any way. And now these days are gone, I'm not so selfish, oh. Now I finally changed my mind, I've opened up the doors. Help me if you can, I'm feeling down. And I do appreciate you being around. Help me get my feet back on the ground. Won't you please, please help me?
I would say he was a very witty guy, very friendly, comical, artistic.
If you didn't know him at all, he looked like somebody you probably wouldn't want to know. An aura of, don't come too close to me or I'll butt you, or something like that. If he was a friend, I think you could rely on him wholeheartedly.
But I look back on 5 years and it was just one laugh after laugh after laugh. It was great. We thoroughly enjoyed our schooling. We laughed our way through. This was mostly John Lennon who was at the bottom. It was always good fun.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of a naughty boy, but a lot of talent.
I think one of the reasons John did so much charity work later on is to make up for being such a little bastard when he was younger.
I think he was determined to succeed, and I think he'd chosen the route that he was going to succeed. He was going to be a star.
He was the leader of the best pop group the planet Earth has ever had, and we'll be singing Beatles songs for as long as we've got the breath in our body to hum the tunes.
The world knew that there was some greatness about him, and he'd make it in the world somehow, because he was just so unusual as a character. He couldn't just go unnoticed. He had a presence.
But now these days are gone, I'm not so selfish, oh.
For John Lennon, life before fame was never easy. Somehow he lived through most of World War II, austerity, and family difficulties. He experienced death at first hand with the loss of his father figure Uncle George and his great friend Stuart Sutcliffe, but most of all with the loss of his mother, Julia. It was his childhood and adolescence that shaped the man the world came to know. John Lennon.
Won't you please, please help me?
I mean, it's just a fact that that's what makes you what you are, childhood. There's no getting away from it.
Help! I need somebody. Help! Not just anybody. Help! You know I need someone.